Hello and welcome to this special presentation as Good Old Days remembers the little country schoolhouse. I'm Ken Tate, your host and the editor of Good Old Days, the magazine that remembers the best. Come with us on this journey back to when the one-room schoolhouse was where we learned reading, writing, and arithmetic, and so much more. Back in the days of my primary education, there was no kindergarten, Head Start, or preschool. Children went to school at age 6, and that was to first grade. Many times, first grade was in the same room with several other grades, but the interaction of older children was usually a positive experience for the younger of us. Since I had a Columbus Day birthday, Mama and Daddy decided I should start school before I turned 6. I had watched with thinly veiled envy while older brother Dennis attended school alone. But now it was my turn, so on that warm early September morning, I checked and double-checked my satchel to make sure I had all of the necessities of a mature first grader. Number 2 pencil, writing tablet, lunch packed in a paper bag, and then headed out into the world of education. One of my favorite poems by John Greenleaf Whittier is In School Days. In it he speaks of the little country schoolhouse. Still sits the schoolhouse by the road, a ragged beggar sleeping. And it still the sumacs grow, and blackberry vines are creeping. The school of my youth was not exactly a ragged beggar sleeping, but by the time I passed through its hallowed halls, it had already seen its better days. A stone edifice, stones were easy to come by in those rocky Ozark Mountains, I suppose. It stood at the top of a tall hill. It was the same school my mother had attended, so the mason's work had expertly stood the test of time. From the letters and articles I've received over the years as editor of Good Old Days magazine, many of my readers have an extraordinary memory of their first day in school. I don't. I know we sat quietly and obediently following the directions of Ms. Leatherman. I remember her name. But particulars escape me. All particulars but one I'm embarrassed to admit. Sometime in mid-morning we were released for recess, as I'm sure most primary schools did. And also, like most of the small country schools at that time, our playground, a converted field really, was equipped only with a couple of swings from tree limbs and a crude baseball field. Still, recess was something I could do well. My toes ached to be out of those confounded shoes, and in the warmth of the late summer sun, I shucked them faster than an ear of corn. For the next 10 minutes or so, I was in heaven. I ran with friends, threw rocks, harassed girls, all of the fun things a first grader loves to do. Dennis never once acted as if he were any relation to me at all, but that was fine with me. Who needed a mentor now? I was in my element at recess. I followed a lizard down a slope to a small rock bluff. By the time I realized I wasn't going to be able to catch him and return to the playground, all of my mates had mysteriously disappeared. What the heck? I'd played alone before, and I knew they would all be back sooner or later. After a few minutes, I looked up from the dirt pile I was playing in to see Ms. Leatherman approaching with a rather stern look on her face. After a brief discussion about truancy, I was escorted by the ear back into the little country schoolhouse and my first taste of education. I remember every teacher I ever had, and with good reason. Every one of them was instrumental in molding me into the person I am today. I'm sure I made some proud, some not so proud, and drove a few more than a little crazy. We probably all had a special teacher, one person who went above and beyond to help us in our childhood. Author Sandra Sylvester remembered Miss Lucy, her special teacher.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Bertha Lucy was astride a broomstick, galloping around her room. Her dramatic interpretation of Longfellow's Paul Revere's ride was interspersed with clucking sounds representing Paul's horse. She'd had the attention of every one of her 25 or 30 fifth graders. Maybe her method of teaching was unorthodox, but we remembered it long after we passed through her 5th grade. It left us with memories of laughter and joy instead of the drudgery usually associated with learning poetry. Later on in life, whenever I came across Paul Revere's ride in an anthology, I immediately saw in my mind's eye Miss Lucy galloping briskly on Broomstick. Everyone had a special teacher that they remember. Miss Lucy was mine. Old maid school teachers are supposed to be very stern and proper. Not Miss Lucy. The only thing proper about Miss Lucy was her black, thick-heeled shoes, her tall, ungainly body and her long, slender hands forever in motion. Her flashing brown eyes and her ready smile gave away the imp in her. If I remember correctly, she wore more makeup than was acceptable then for a woman of her age and position. 5th grade meant fractions. I always had trouble with math, but not in the 5th grade. When I got frustrated over a problem, Miss Lucy would come up by my desk, maybe even sit down in a chair beside me, and explain very slowly and quietly how to do the problem. Her voice would calm me until I could see more clearly what the trouble was. That's the way she was with everybody in the class. She would toss her head of short black curls, smile in that special way of hers, and what had been a world-shaking catastrophe didn't seem so terrible anymore. We often say that some people are born teachers. I believe Bertha Lucy could have been the inspiration for this idea. My New England town had some rough characters, and we had a good portion of them in the 5th grade room. At least they thought they were pretty tough, until they met up with Miss Lucy. Her only weapons were a piece of chalk and a special place on the blackboard. It was all she needed to maintain discipline. All eyes would look up when she headed in that direction. She would lift her chalk and very angrily write a name. We sighed with relief when we saw it wasn't ours, because having our name on the blackboard meant staying after school. If one continually disobeyed after his name was up there, another mark went beside that name, which meant still another day after school. The worst part about having one's name on the blackboard was that it stayed there all day. The culprit got teased at recess. Worse, all the visitors to the room, including the principal, also saw it. The embarrassment was much worse than having to stay after school. If Miss Lucy hadn't been a teacher, she could very well have been a concert violinist. She did, in fact, give concerts in the community. She also played for us. When she played the violin, she was in ecstasy. Holding her violin in the classic position, she would draw the bow across the strings, her fingers quivering the way all violinists do. Then she closed her eyes. Her body would sway to the music, and we couldn't help but be carried away with her. Even the rowdy boys who hated music and hated to sing were enraptured along with the rest of us when Miss Lucy played her violin. I'm sure her playing carried to the other rooms, as the walls in that old school were thin. But the other teachers never complained that it disrupted their classes. They and their pupils were probably listening right along with us. We were the lucky ones, however, because we had front row seats. Music played a big part in our 5th grade. Every morning we had opening exercises. We saluted the flag, said the Lord's Prayer, and maybe recited a psalm. Praying and Bible reading hadn't been banned yet, thank heavens. Then came the singing. Sometimes we sang God Bless America or the Star-Spangled Banner, but once in a while she would let those who wished sing a solo or duet of their choosing. One morning several children sang, and then my girlfriend and I decided we wanted to sing a duet. We sang Springtime in the Rockies, or something like that. It was an old Western tune. When we finished, Miss Lucy suggested that the class vote on who had the best voice that morning. As it turned out, I won. I was flabbergasted, as I thought my girlfriend had a much better voice than I did. I'd like to think that Miss Lucy knew what the outcome of that vote would be, and saw the chance to instill some confidence in an otherwise shy little girl. Many years have passed since I was one of Miss Lucy's 5th graders. The old Purchase Street school where she taught us and so many others was torn down years ago, but you can't tear down memories, especially happy ones. Now and then I wonder if my old classmates remember Miss Lucy and her broomstick ride around the classroom that afternoon.
The old one-room schools were hot in the summer and cold in the winter. The teachers in them also had to be janitor, which included keeping the fire going through the long winters. But pity poor H.M. Sletten, the teacher in a small Nebraska district, who burned too much coal.
They don't aim to hire you back next year. The board reckons as how you're a fair to middling teacher, but you burned just too darn much coal this winter. This dire message, relayed to me by my friend Hank, climaxed my first year of teaching. The story begins in the early summer of 1932. 20 years old and fresh from a 2-year training course in a teacher's college, I looked for a teaching position. About 60 frustrating days and hundreds of hitchhiked miles later, I was offered a job in a one-room rural school. A teacher had resigned, choosing marriage before another lonely year in Paradise School District. On a Saturday afternoon in early October, I disembarked from the branch line train at a tiny town at the end of the line. I had arranged to board and room with a farm family who lived tolerably close to the school where I would teach. I was standing on the depot platform, gazing dejectedly at the departing train, when Hank ambled up. Seeing as how I was the only passenger, he came up with an inspired observation. "You must be the new teacher, and you must be Henry Johnsgard." "Yep." One huge, hairy paw wiped a trickle of tobacco juice from a bewhiskered chin, and the other crunched the bones in my right hand. "Are you ready?" Hank led the way to his wagon. 4 horses were hitched to a grain tank, heaped high with large lumps of lignite coal. Hauling a load of wheat to town, toting home a part of the winter's coal supply, and meeting the new teacher was all in a day's work for Hank. He was a very practical man. He tossed my suitcase to the very top of the load, where momentarily it teetered precariously and then wedged itself between 2 huge chunks. "Climb up," said Hank, "and we'll start for home." It turned out to be 7 dusty miles to Hank's farm, and the horses plodded along with the heavily loaded wagon. "Emma, this is the new teacher." Thus I met the wonderful people with whom I was to live for the next 8 months. Their warmth and kindliness more than made up for what they lacked in material comforts. My bedroom was an attic loft reached by climbing a ladder. Emma hesitatingly asked if I would mind sharing the bed with Jenny. Jenny was 6 years old and destined to be one of my first-grade pupils. She was also to become my pal and confidant. I remember the ponderous horsehide robe that covered us on cold winter nights. Sunday afternoon I hiked up to my school. The tolerable distance turned out to be 3/4 of a mile, taking a shortcut through the pasture. The dilapidated little schoolhouse was perched atop a rock-covered hill amid a treeless expanse of rolling prairie wasteland. A ramshackle barn and 2 decrepit outhouses completed this rustic campus. A dispirited and lonely young teacher sat on the schoolhouse steps that evening and watched the autumn sun lower over bleak hills. The next morning, 18 assorted youngsters were on hand, bright and early, to stare with misgivings at the new teacher. 5 were first-graders. These I viewed with trepidation. My practice teaching had been in 8th grade history. How could I teach beginning reading? Those first days I waited hopefully for the county superintendent to come to my rescue. We were well into the 2nd week when her Model A Ford came chugging up the rocky trail. Dear little gray-haired lady, I could have kissed her. Patiently she guided my faltering efforts with the beginners. When she left at the end of the day, she had given me some semblance of confidence. I was not to see her again until spring. She had roughly 50 schools to visit, and snow made mine inaccessible. Winter's icy blast brought new problems. Occasionally, some of the pupils were delivered to the door by a horse-drawn sleigh. More often than not, pathetic little figures trudged across snow-covered hills. Frostbite was common, and there was the incessant worry of sudden blizzards. Parents seemed to have complete faith in God and the teacher, while I, knowing the teacher pretty well, did a lot of praying. One thoughtless lout, upon delivering a load of children, proclaimed for all to hear, "Pearl smells like a billy goat." Pearl was 14 years old. Her sobs did not subside until noon. The allegation was not without basis in fact. Saturday night ablution, starting with the youngest, took place in a washtub by the stove. By the time 6 or 7 had preceded her, Pearl was asleep, or the hot water was used up. Came spring, and the bleak prairie hills erupted with gay crocuses. During recess periods we played softball, and at times perhaps were a little tardy in getting back to lessons. My first-graders, including Jenny, were reading tolerably well, as noted happily by Emma and Hank. Reluctantly I marked off each passing day. Hank torpedoed my contentment in his inimitable brusque fashion. "They don't aim to hire you back for next year. The board reckons as how you're a fair to middlin' teacher. The young'uns have all learned to read tolerably well, but you've burned just too darn much coal this winter." A tinge of bitterness crept through my shocked disbelief. My school stood on a hill, utterly naked and exposed to frigid winds. The other two schools in the district were partially sheltered by trees and faced south. Hank knew my thoughts. "That building of yourn is as drafty as long-handled underwear with the trap door down. It always takes some more coal, but nothing like you burned up." Seeing my crestfallen countenance, Hank tried to save the day with a dandy, "Well, anyhow, you're the hottest teacher in the whole darn county." His guffaw tapered off abruptly with Emma's icy glance. Hank's bombshell echoed in my mind. "A fair to middling teacher, but you burn just too darned much coal." So this was the measuring stick. Stinking lumps of lignite coal counted more than the fact that my beginners could read tolerably well. I had failed in my first school. The next few days Hank was away more than usual. I was to realize later that a seed of suspicion had sprouted in that practical mind of his. With characteristic thoroughness, he launched his own private investigation among the neighbors. It bore fruit. He tried to be casual as he triumphantly announced, "Well, you're hired back. Seems as how the feller that hauled coal to your school got a mite light-fingered. Part of each load went into his own coal shed at home." Gone is the one-room school, unwept. Of the children, I can only speculate. Doubtless, somewhere, Pearl revels in the luxury of indoor plumbing. I like to think that Jenny succeeded. After all, she did learn to read tolerably well.
Many of us memorized poetry at the feet of teachers, grandparents, and parents. I had to memorize more poetry than I care to think about now. One oft-requested poem is about an old man mourning the loss of his best girl 40 years after her death. Back in their youth, she asked his forgiveness after setting him down in a spelling contest. I know you'll enjoy John Greenleaf Whittier's In School Days.
Still sets the schoolhouse by the road, a ragged beggar sleeping, and it's still the sumacs grow, and blackberry vines are creeping. Within, the master's desk is seen, deep scarred by raps official, the warping floor, the battered seats, the jackknife's carved initial, the charcoal frescoes on its wall, its door's worn sill, betraying the feet that, creeping slow to school, went storming out to playing. Long years ago, a winter sun shone over it at setting, lit up its western window panes and low eaves icy fretting. It touched the tangled golden curls and brown eyes full of grieving, of one who still her steps delayed when all the school were leaving. For near her stood the little boy, her childish favor singled, his cap pulled low upon a face where pride and shame were mingled. Pushing with restless feet the snow to right and left, he lingered, as restlessly her tiny hands the blue-checked apron fingered. He saw her lift her eyes, he felt the soft hand's light caressing, and heard the tremble of her voice, as if a fault confessing. "I'm sorry that I spelt the word, I hate to go above you, because," the brown eyes lower fell, "because, you see, I love you." Still memory to a gray-haired man that sweet child face is showing. Dear girl, the grasses on her grave have 40 years been growing. He lives to learn in life's hard school how few who pass above him lament their triumph and his loss, like her, because they love him.
Later it was called Skip Day, but when Julia Rankin and her cohorts all played hooky, it just spelled trouble. Go back with us to the good old days and see what happened when the whole school played hooky.
I attended my first year of school in the hills of North Carolina, in a one-teacher log schoolhouse with a fireplace for heat and backless benches for the students. Our fathers didn't like this, so they voted themselves extra taxes, and the next year we had a two-teacher, two-room school with shiny desks. We were proud and everything was fine, until the money gave out at the end of 5 months. The school board asked Mr. Jones, one of the teachers, to continue to conduct the school 2 months longer as a subscription school. Mr. Jones agreed, and about a quarter of the enthusiastic children were enrolled, including me and Sue and Dave, my sister and brother. When winter had passed and warm spring days came, everyone in school had spring fever. Why waste this glorious weather in school? Hank, one of the big boys, passed the word that at noon the next Wednesday, all of us would play hooky for the rest of the day. That sounded great, but some of us little ones were afraid. However, Hank threatened us with dire consequences if we didn't obey his orders, and we fearfully agreed. Wednesday was a perfect day for a picnic, and at noon we took our 10 lunch buckets and went into a wooded area where we could not be seen from the schoolhouse. We giggled at our daring. Fortified by our lunches, we began having fun. The big girls talked and laughed. Big boys played ball, and little boys played marbles, and the little girls had a pretend theater. After we all tired of playing, we sat on the ground in a ring and made up stories. One told the beginning, the next one added to it, and on until someone gave a smashing dramatic ending. Soon, it seemed, long shadows warned that it was late in the day. It was only then that we realized the enormity of what we had done. After consulting among ourselves, we agreed to go back to school, sit at our desks, and wait for Mr. Jones to dismiss us for the day. But it didn't work out that way. We slipped quietly into the schoolroom and found Mr. Jones at his desk reading. When all were seated, he looked up and called the first afternoon class. He continued through the usual schedule. The only thing he left out was the little recess. Most of us had not prepared these lessons, and when we missed a question, Mr. Jones wrote something in a book. That didn't make us feel any better. It was much later than our usual 4 o'clock dismissal time when we were allowed to go home. We exchanged many anxious glances before we left. Parents asked such embarrassing questions. Besides, most of us had night work to do, and we knew there was no getting out of it. At home, Mama was in a dither. Papa was not expected home until after supper, and we were late from school. We started for the old kitchen safe for our usual after-school snack, but Mama stopped us. There's no time for eating until after your night work is done. I was hungry. Ever since I had started to school, I wanted to eat as soon as I got home. Education made me hungry, but when Mama spoke in that tone of voice, it was like the laws of the Medes and the Persians. There was no wriggling out. We did our night work, but before we started, Mama said ominously, "When your father comes home, we'll have a talk." Subdued and hungry, we hurried back to work. I brought in a basket of kindling and went to gather eggs. The chickens had gone to roost, but an old setting hen was on her nest. She pecked me hard when I felt under her to get any fresh eggs she might have stolen from the nest near her. Dave had to do his barn work by lantern light. The pigs and horses scolded because their supper was late. After I got through with the eggs, I held the lantern for him, not because he was a swell brother. Sometimes he was a real stinker. But it helped me get through earlier, and I was hungry. At last, he finished and supper was ready, and late. We were so hungry that we ate Sue's burned potatoes and sloppy beans without complaint. When Mama saw that we were devouring everything in sight, she cut a piece of apple pie and filled a plate with meat and vegetables and put them on the warming shelf over the kitchen range to save for Papa. That was one time that she didn't say, "It's a sin to waste food, but what am I going to do with all these leftovers?" That night, there were no leftovers. Mama was still stern. "Your father is on the school board. It will shame him to know what his own children have done. He and other fathers paid Mr. Jones to teach the extra 2 months. Mr. Jones was right not to let you lose a half day that is paid for." We listened meekly. At last, we were no longer hungry. Papa came home while Sue and I were washing dishes. Mama took him the supper she had saved and sat with him while he ate. Sue and I listened at the dining room door and peeped through the crack. Yes, she told him that we were late from school because the whole school played hooky, as if it was the worst sin of the ages. I held my breath to hear what Papa would say. He grinned. "You mean the whole school played hooky?" "Yes, and Mr. Jones kept them until the afternoon classes were done. It was nearly dark when they got home. Papa gave his big belly laugh. "It's not funny," Mama said stiffly. "You're on the school board and your own children behaved so badly." "I guess the young'uns found that their hooky backfired," he chuckled. "You must punish them since their teacher didn't." "Oh, but he did. Imagine what the kids thought when they had to do all that work before they could leave. I bet some got trips to the woodshed, too." "Well, I scolded them and wouldn't let them have their usual afternoon snack until they'd done all their night work," Mama admitted. "Poor hungry kids," Papa said, his eyes twinkling. "Well, maybe I was too hard on them," Mama said, "but I was so worried when they were late. I was afraid they were hurt or something. Then, when they did come home looking so guilty, I got mad because I'd worried. I guess I did take my temper out on them." Papa laughed. "Remember, the good die young. Our kids will probably live to be 100 or thereabouts." Mama stared at him and then smiled slowly. "It seems they bumped into a couple of backfires in one day," Papa grinned. "That ought to be enough punishment for any sin." That made me and Sue feel better, and we went back to washing dishes. Next day at school, we expected the worst, but nothing happened. We whispered among ourselves, wondering what Mr. Jones would do to us, but he did nothing. I noticed that Tom and Sam Hunt sat down carefully. Their sister, Nan, a tattletale, said her father and Tom and Sam spent some time in the woodshed with a shingle, but she didn't say why. Soon we stopped expecting punishment. But hadn't we been punished anyway? All that worry and fear, 2 backfires in one day, were worse than staying in at recess or the woodshed, whatever that meant. Maybe Papa and Mr. Jones had had backfires when they were young and knew how awful it felt. But one thing I do know, we never played hooky again while Mr. Jones was our teacher.